The 24th of May, 1970, the Soviet Union began a project that would be etched into the annals of history, the Kola Superdeep Borehole. Though it was long abandoned, the hole still stands today, its depth stretching down some 40,000 feet. Research claims vary, but one thing is certain. Rushes deep. Dark ventures into the earth went further than they should have, leaving behind holes unprotected in the desolate wilderness. I made the biggest mistake of my life by going down one of those holes. It was just a year ago when my work led me to a small fishing village in Siberia, a place so tiny it housed no more than 200 people, most of them fishermen, hunters, and the like. Being a geologist, I was no stranger to strange situations. But this place, it was different, a world cut off from the rest of civilization. My Russian was rusty, barely functional, and since only two people besides my team spoke English, communication was a challenge. Still, the locals were warm, friendly. A bottle of vodka could melt away any barrier. And there was one person in particular, a police officer, who spoke enough English to be our bridge. His job was mostly to escort drunk villagers home, though he often joined in on the drinking himself. We quickly became good friends, bonding over the weirdness of the world we found ourselves in. But things changed on the 9th month of our deployment. A young girl went missing. Darla, just 7 years old, had been playing with her friends near an old, abandoned building, thought to be a Soviet-era silo. The place had been closed off for decades, forgotten by time. But the kids still loved to hang around, exploring the ruins. On this particular day, the silo doors had been mysteriously opened. Inside, there was a large, dark hole, almost 50 feet in diameter. The room was full of ancient equipment, but the hole, it was the kind of thing that pulled you in. The children told us that Darla had fallen into the hole. There was no hope of survival. The depth was impossible to measure, but the bottom was probably submerged in water. The other kids claimed to have heard her scream for help, a cry that led us to believe that there was a faint chance she might still be alive. But as much as I hoped, I knew in my gut that it was a lost cause. I immediately took charge, trying to organize a search and rescue operation. The locals were frantic, and the village was in chaos. A rescue team was needed, but by the time any official help arrived, it would be far too late. So, with experience in this field, I volunteered. Stanley, a colleague of mine, and I would go down. The mechanics worked feverishly to get the old elevator functioning again, while I rigged up a line with a sinker to try and measure the depth. But the ropes weren't long enough. Even the longest ones, stretched almost 1,000 feet, couldn't reach far enough to reveal the bottom. After hours of work, the mechanics managed to get the elevator working, but that was just the beginning of the nightmare. We found old protective suits in the facility, but the documents indicated that the atmospheric pressure down there was dangerously high, and the temperature would reach up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. It became clear to me then we would retrieve nothing but the lifeless body of a little girl. The team geared up, but the suits didn't fit. They were poorly designed, uncomfortable, and ill-suited for such an operation. I could already feel the chafing, the pressure, and the overwhelming sense of dread building inside me. We had no idea what awaited us down there, but I knew this was a decision we would all regret. The cold, suffocating air seemed to press in on me as we descended into the unknown. The deeper we went, the more oppressive it became. Every inch of that hole was a testament to the unholy things the Soviets had left behind. And something had been waiting for us. I didn't know it was possible for things to go wrong so quickly, but there we were, descending into the depths. We entered through the left side, which was sealed by a rusty metal cage riddled with holes. There was only one walkie-talkie for communication with the surface and a few weak flashlights to guide us. We were ready, or at least we thought we were. Stanley, soldering the equipment, gave me a grim look as the elevator platform started its journey down. The old machine creaked and groaned, its movement excruciatingly slow, barely a foot per second. But I could feel it, something was about to change, and we hadn't even reached the first 100 feet. The darkness swallowed us, and the weak beams from our flashlights did little to push it back. "You think this is dark?" Stanley said with a sad laugh. "Wait until you see the winner in the village." I chuckled nervously, trying to keep things light, but then something felt off. "Check the radio, will ya?" I asked. Stanley didn't respond right away. "It works." "No worries," he muttered, but I could tell he wasn't so sure. By the time we had descended to 500 feet, the walkie-talkie crackled to life. A burst of static cut through, followed by a voice in Russian, unclear, muffled. "What was that?" I asked, straining to hear ... "Oh, they just asked how deep we are," Stanley replied, but his voice sounded strange, almost distant. "Shouldn't we be able to hear them better?" "We're only 500 feet down," I asked, my unease creeping in. "Yeah, something strange," Stanley muttered, his voice tinged with a note I hadn't heard before. For the first time, I noticed the silence. The hum of the elevator machinery was all we could hear. There was no chatter from the surface, no sound of movement above. It was unsettling. "Other than the electrical hum, it's really quiet," Stanley said, shifting nervously on the platform. I nodded, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, faint at first, barely perceptible. "Guys, is it just me, or is it getting really warm in here?" Stanley asked, his voice drenched in sweat. "I'm sweating bullets already," I replied, wiping my forehead. The heat was unbearable, but I couldn't focus on that. I was too distracted by the growing sense that something was wrong. At 1,000 feet, it happened. A voice, a soft, distant cry from below ... "Did you hear that?" I asked, my eyes wide. "Hear what?" Stanley snapped, looking around. I put a finger to my lips, gesturing for silence. Then, again, faint, but unmistakable. "Help!" It was barely a whisper, but it was there. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Did you hear it?" I asked, turning to Stanley. "Yes," he said, his voice tense. "I heard it too." But it wasn't just the word that unnerved me. It was the way it sounded, in English. In a tiny Siberian village. How could that be? The locals barely spoke it. The voice, clear and desperate, should not have known English. I called out into the darkness, my voice echoing, "Who's down there? Can you hear me?" There was nothing but silence. Nothing but the oppressive weight of the abyss pressing in on us. "Damn it, can we make this thing go faster?" I growled, slamming my fist into the side of the platform. The hours crawled by, the depth marker creeping ever lower. At 4,000 feet, I was starting to doubt we would ever reach the bottom, let alone find anything. The voice hadn't come back, and the oppressive heat was making it hard to think. My head throbbed painfully. "Guys," Stanley said suddenly, his voice shaky, "I see a light." "A light?" I asked, disbelieving. "Yes, look. Down there." Stanley was frantic, jumping up and pointing towards the darkness below. I glanced down. There was nothing, just the swirling blackness of the pit. "Stanley, what are you talking about? There's nothing down there." He continued to point, his face flushed with urgency. "No, I swear, it's so bright." I looked over at him, confused. Was he losing it? Was the heat getting to him? Maybe he was hallucinating. But the light he claimed to see ... it wasn't real. There was no light, only the consuming blackness that stretched on forever. At 5,000 feet, everything started to unravel. We hadn't spoken a word in what felt like hours. The air had become thicker, heavier, and my headache was nearly unbearable. I tried to focus, but then, the elevator jolted, a violent shake. The platform dropped, jerking violently as if something massive had collided with it. And then, everything went black. When I came to, the world was spinning. I was on the floor of the platform, the pain in my head unbearable. I looked around. Stanley was motionless beside me, his body limp. Fahim was gone. Stanley, are you okay? I shook his shoulder, but he didn't move. The only sound was the hum of the machinery and the deafening silence of the abyss. He grunted as he sat up, confusion in his eyes. What the hell just happened? I don't know, man, but Fahim's gone. Why? Where did he go? I don't know. He just vanished. We scanned the area, but there was no sign of him. There was no way out of the elevator. The cage surrounding us was rusty and full of holes, but it was still too small for a man the size of Fahim to slip through. Did you find the walkie? Stanley asked, his voice desperate. I handed him the device, and he immediately tried to call for help. Static was all we heard. We called out for Fahim, but there was no response. He was gone, vanished without a trace. The elevator began its descent again, the groaning machine taking us deeper into the abyss. Let's go back up, Stanley pleaded. I clicked a few buttons on the panel, but the controls were unresponsive. The ones at the surface are the only ones working, I told him. Stanley began screaming for help, begging the people at the top to bring us back up, but deep down, we both knew there was no way they could hear us all the way down here. We were 10,000 feet below the surface, and it had already taken more than 4 hours to get that deep. The heat was unbearable, and it only got worse the further we descended. I had already passed out from dehydration, despite bringing plenty of water. Why haven't they brought us back up? Stanley asked, his voice weak and strained. He was older than me, and the heat was taking a toll on him. I didn't know how much longer either of us could last. I don't know. Is it even possible to be this far down? I muttered. Stanley didn't answer. He had passed out, and I didn't have the strength to wake him up. Just as I was about to lose consciousness again, something jolted me awake. It was the sound of singing. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, though I didn't understand the words. It was in Russian, and the melody was hauntingly pure, serene. I turned to Stanley, my voice barely a whisper. Stanley, can you hear that? Who's singing? He mumbled something, but it didn't matter. The singing grew louder, and then the light appeared. It was soft at first, but it grew brighter, warmer, and I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. I see it, I whispered, entranced. The light. But then, Stanley was gone. Just like Fahim, he vanished, leaving only the light behind. The light moved towards me, and as it grew closer, I felt calmer, as though everything was right in the world. I reached out, and then nothing. I woke up a week later in a hospital in Russia. The hunters had found me, wandering in the forest, disoriented and confused. I had no identification, no proof of who I was. When they asked about my story, they said it didn't add up. No such hole existed in public records. I tried to trace back my steps, but the village where I'd stayed for almost a year wasn't even on the map. I didn't recognize anything. My memories were fragmented. Holes were entire weeks, even months, seemed to have slipped away. I tried reaching out to my colleagues, but when I called their numbers, they were disconnected or linked to completely unrelated people. It didn't make sense. After months of investigation, I was allowed to return to the United States on an emergency travel document. But when I arrived, I discovered something even worse. My home was no longer mine. Someone else had been living there for over 10 years. It was as if I had never existed there at all. The changes were too drastic to be a coincidence. I dug deeper, trying to piece together what had happened, but the world around me had shifted. History had changed. Geography didn't match up with what I had studied, and there was an entire continent missing from the maps. I couldn't ignore it any longer. This was not the world I had known. The more I searched, the more I realized. Somehow, I was no longer in my own reality. This wasn't the world I belonged to.